The archive smelled like the end of things. That was the only way Mira Voss had ever been able to describe it, to the handful of people who had ever bothered to ask about her work, which was not many people, and not very often. It was not an unpleasant smell, not exactly. It was the smell of leather that had dried and cracked and dried again over the span of generations. The smell of ink that had oxidized into something closer to rust. The smell of wood that had slowly, over centuries, begun its quiet negotiation with decay. It was the smell of everything that had once mattered so much that someone had written it down, and then mattered so little that no one had read it since. Mira loved it. She had loved it since her first day as a junior cataloger 7 years ago, when she had been handed a lamp, a set of linen gloves, and a map of the lower stacks that proved immediately useless because half the corridors on it no longer existed, and 3 that did exist were not on it at all. She had gotten lost for 4 hours that first day. She had not minded. The archive had felt, even then, like a place that understood something about her that she had not yet been able to articulate about herself, which was that she was most comfortable in the presence of things that had been forgotten. It was not a fashionable gift, what she had. In the kingdom of Veltharion, where supernatural ability was the primary currency of social standing, the ability to read memory from objects was considered a minor talent at best, and a parlor trick at worst. The great houses valued combat gifts, dominance gifts, the kind of power that could be seen and measured and turned into an advantage at the negotiating table or the battlefield. Mira's gift was considered useful for archival work, and not much else, which was precisely why she had been assigned to archival work, and left there, quietly, for 7 years, while colleagues with more impressive abilities moved upward through the guilds, and the councils and the elaborate hierarchies of Veltharion's supernatural society. She did not, on most days, mind this either. She had her archive. She had her work. She had the particular satisfaction that came from bringing order to chaos, from finding the thread of a story in a jumble of unidentified objects and following it back to something coherent. She had a small apartment above a bakery that smelled, at 7 in the morning, like the most comforting thing in the world. She had a cat, named Sable, who regarded her with the philosophical detachment of a creature who has decided that all human behavior is mildly baffling, but rarely worth intervening in. She would have told you, enough. And she had believed it, right up until the night she was given access to the Forbidden Archive, and everything she thought she knew about her own life turned out to be a prologue to something else entirely. The assignment had come from Senior Archivist Devon, who had delivered it with the particular combination of bureaucratic apology and thinly veiled relief that Mira had learned to recognize as the signature of a task that no one more important wanted. The Forbidden Archive, located in the sub-basement of the guild hall beneath 3 locked doors and a ward seal that required Mira's special clearance to cross, contained relics confiscated by the guild over the past several centuries, objects deemed too dangerous, too politically sensitive, or too difficult to classify through normal channels. They had been piling up down there for 400 years, and the current guild leadership had decided, apparently, that it was finally time to produce a proper inventory. No one's done a full catalog since the reorganization, Devon had told her, sliding the assignment across his desk with the careful neutrality of a man who was deeply relieved not to be doing this himself. We need to know what's down there. Documented, classified, shelved properly. Your clearance level is sufficient. Your gift is appropriate for the work. And frankly, there is no one else in the building I would trust not to accidentally activate something they shouldn't. This last part had been meant as a compliment. Mira had accepted it as such. She had taken the keys, the assignment, and a fresh set of cataloging supplies, and she had descended into the sub-basement, and she had gotten to work. That had been 3 weeks ago. She had been making steady progress, methodically working her way through the contents of the first 2 rooms, documenting objects whose memories were sad and strange and sometimes terrible, but never anything that felt like active danger. A mirror that showed the viewer their deepest regret. A set of brass scales that wept real tears when used to weigh anything except gold. A book that wrote new chapters every night in the handwriting of someone who had been dead for 200 years. These were unsettling objects, certainly, but they were inert in the way. That old grief is inert, present and heavy, but no longer capable of the sharp, sudden damage it once could do. It was in the third room that she found the metal hoe. It was sitting on a shelf by itself, which should have been her first indication that it was not like the other objects. Everything else in the forbidden archive had been stacked and piled and jumbled together with the cheerful disorder of 4 centuries of people dumping things they didn't want to deal with. But the metal hoe sat, alone on a shelf that had been cleared of everything else, and it sat in the center of that shelf with a kind of deliberateness that made Mira stop in the doorway and simply look at it for a long moment before she went any further. It was a medallion, roughly the size of her palm, made of a black stone that did not reflect light the way stones should. Most black stones had a sheen to them, a quality of surface that told you there was something there to reflect. This stone seemed to absorb light, rather than reflect it, so that the lamp she was carrying made the room brighter, but somehow made the medallion itself less visible, as though it existed slightly outside the normal rules of illumination. A chain of dull metal ran through a loop at its top. A name was engraved on its face in characters she recognized as Old Velthari, the archaic script that she had spent 3 years learning, specifically because so many of the archive's oldest objects were labeled in it. She put on her gloves. She reached for her cataloging notebook. She did everything correctly, everything in exactly the proper order, because Mira Voss was a person who did things correctly and in the proper order. And then she picked up the metal hoe to read its memory, because that was her job, and it was what she did. And the moment her fingers closed around the stone, she felt something in the archive's deep, settled silence shift, like a held breath finally released after an impossibly long time. She read the name, before she understood what reading it would mean. That was the thing about her gift. It was not always a matter of choice. Sometimes the memory in an object was so compressed, so deliberately stored, that it came through her fingertips and up through her hands and into her mind all at once before she could decide whether she wanted to receive it. And the name in the stone was not merely engraved on the surface, it was pressed into every layer of it, written in the molecular structure of the obsidian itself, sealed there with intention and power, and something that felt, to Mira's gift, like the memory of a man who had decided that if he was going to be imprisoned, the least he could do was make certain that whoever released him would know exactly who he was. Cale Vorn. She said it aloud before she realized she was speaking, her voice very small in the silence of the archive's third room, and the moment the second syllable left her mouth, the temperature dropped by what felt like 15 degrees, and the lamp went out. Mira stood very still in the dark. She was a practical person, generally, not given to panic, trained by years in the archive to understand that strange things happened around old objects, and the correct response was usually stillness and careful observation. She stood still, and she observed, and what she observed was that there was someone else in the room with her. She could not see him. The room was completely dark, the kind of dark that felt almost physical, the kind that pressed against the eyes with a weight of its own. But she could feel him the way she felt the memory in objects, a presence that had depth and history, and the particular quality of something that had been contained for a very long time, and was now, suddenly and completely, free. She could feel that he was large, not just in the physical sense, but in the older sense. The way an ocean is large, the way a mountain is large, the way something is large when it has been in the world longer than the names that exist for largeness. "You read my name," said a voice in the dark. It was a low voice, not a growl, not the theatrical rumble of a supernatural creature announcing itself, but simply a voice that was low the way old things are low, settled into itself by time and use, carrying harmonics of something that had never been entirely human, even at its most human. It was not a threatening voice precisely. It was more careful than that. It was the voice of something that had learned, perhaps at great cost, that careful was safer than threatening. "I did," Mira said. Her own voice came out steadier than she felt, which was something. It was engraved on the object I was cataloging. Reading what's on objects is my job. A silence. Then, You are not afraid. I am, she said honestly. My hands are shaking. But I've found that doing the shaking and talking at the same time is usually more productive than just doing the shaking. Another silence. Longer this. Time. And she had the sense that whatever was in the dark with her was recalibrating something. How long? The voice said finally. Have I been sealed? The question was not what she had expected. She had expected something larger. Something more immediately dangerous. A demand. A threat. The kind of declaration that an ancient power made upon release. Instead, she had been given a question that sounded, under its careful flatness, like a man asking something he was frightened of the answer to. I don't know, she said. The archive I'm cataloging contains objects confiscated over approximately 400 years. The shelf where I found your metal hoe had been cleared of everything else. That suggests whoever placed it there considered it significant, which suggests it was sealed relatively early in that period. But I haven't had a chance to cross-reference the acquisition records yet. Another silence. Then something she did not expect. The sound of a slow exhale, not quite a sigh, but close to it. The sound of someone absorbing information that is painful, but not surprising. 400 years, the voice said, as though tasting each word and finding them all correct and none of them good. 400 years. Approximately, Mira said, because she was a cataloger and precision was important to her even in extraordinary circumstances. I can find out more exactly if you give me a moment to relight my lamp. She heard him move in the dark. Not toward her, which she appreciated. He moved to what sounded like the far wall, and then she heard him go still again. And the quality of his stillness was the quality of something that has had a very long time to practice not moving. Your lamp will not work, he said. My presence interferes with flame. In the first hours. I apologize for the inconvenience. Mira stood in the dark and considered this. Do you have any light of your own? A pause. Then, slowly, something in the far corner of the room began to glow. Faint and gold, the color of embers banked very low. And in that dim light, she finally saw him. He was, she thought, what 400 years looked like when they had been spent in stillness. He was tall and broad-shouldered, and built in the way of old statues, which was to say that he was built for a kind of physicality that the modern world had mostly stopped requiring. His hair was black and somewhat wild, as though the precise time period of his imprisonment had left its mark in small ways, as well as large ones. His skin was the warm brown of someone who had, at some point in a previous life, spent considerable time in the sun, though there was no sun where he had been. His eyes, when they found hers across the dim and cluttered room, were gold. Not amber, not hazel. Gold. The metallic kind. The kind that seemed to emit rather than merely reflect the low light he was generating. He looked at her with those gold eyes for a long moment, and he did not look like a monster. He looked like a man who was very tired and very wary, and was doing a great deal of careful internal work to remain both of those things rather than becoming something else. You are smaller than I expected, he said, and it sounded like something he had not entirely meant to say aloud. People who invoke ancient sealed entities probably skew toward the intimidating demographic, Mira said. I'm a cataloger. I catalog things. I didn't know what I was reading until I'd already read it. Something shifted in his expression that was not quite amusement, but was at least adjacent to it. And now that you have read it? Now that you know what you have done? Mira looked at him steadily. The gold light he was generating was warming slightly, as though something in the conversation was doing what the lamp could not. Now, she said, I would very much like to understand what exactly I've done, and whether it's going to get me killed, and if so, by whom. The archive's acquisition records go back to the founding of the guild. If your sealing was documented, I should be able to find the record. And if I can find the record, I can find out who put you here and why. He watched her for another long moment. Why would you do that? Because I don't particularly enjoy being in situations I don't understand, she said. And because you are clearly not, at this precise moment, attempting to hurt me, which suggests that the story of how you ended up in that metal home is probably more complicated than whatever the official record says. She picked up her cataloging notebook from where she had set it on the shelf and held it up. Also, because this is very obviously the most significant archival discovery of the past 400 years. And I am a cataloger, and that matters to me on a professional level. He stared at her. Then he said very quietly, "You are a peculiar creature, Miravos." She paused. "I didn't tell you my name." "No," he agreed. "You didn't." And that, Mira thought, was probably the moment she should have been more frightened than she was. But the thing about reading memories from objects was that it gave you a particular relationship with the concept of stored information, with the idea that old things carried within them everything they had ever been. And looking at Kyle Vorn in the dim gold of his own light, she had the very clear sense that she was looking at something that contained more history than she had ever encountered before, and that the history was painful and long, and had been sat with in the dark for 400 years, and that whatever he was not, fundamentally, a thing that wanted to cause harm. She might have been wrong about that. She was aware she might have been wrong, but she had been reading the memories of objects for 7 years, and she trusted what her gift told her. And what it told her now was that the man standing in the corner of the archive's third room was dangerous the way a storm is dangerous, not because it intends damage, but because it is very large and has nowhere else to be, and that he had been in the dark for a very long time, and that she had said his name, and he had not moved toward her, and she thought that mattered. "Tell me what you remember," she said, and sat down on a nearby crate, her notebook open in her lap, her pen ready, as though she were conducting an entirely ordinary interview. "Start from the beginning if you can. I'll cross-reference it against the records when the sun comes up." He looked at her for another long moment. Then, slowly, he moved to the crate farthest from her, and sat down also. And the gold light strengthened slightly, and he began to speak, and that was the beginning. "If you're already finding this story as fascinating as I am, go ahead and hit that like button, because this one is going to take us somewhere extraordinary. Let's keep going." The name Kyle Vorn had not appeared in any of the public records Mira had access to as a senior cataloger, which was in itself significant. Veltharion kept meticulous historical documentation. The Guild's archives contained records dating back to the kingdom's founding, 1,000-year-old ledgers written in Old Velthari on materials that had survived through careful warding against decay. If a supernatural entity of Kale's apparent age and power had existed publicly in Veltharion, there would be references to him everywhere, in the histories and the political records and the accounts of notable events. The same way there were references to the other ancient powers that Veltharion's founding stories acknowledged. The complete absence of his name from every accessible document told Mira, as clearly as a written statement would have, that his absence had been deliberate. Someone had removed him not just from the world, but from the record of the world. She did not tell him this immediately. She spent the rest of that first night listening, asking careful questions, writing in her notebook with the focused attention she brought to every cataloging project. And what she learned was this: Kyle Vorn was, in the old taxonomy of Veltharion's supernatural lineages, what the ancient texts called a primarch, one of the original shapeshifters from whom the later lines of lycanthropes and shifters had descended. The primarchs were theoretical beings in the modern scholarship of Veltharion, which was to say that most contemporary supernaturals knew they had existed the way modern humans know they evolved from earlier primates, as an abstract intellectual fact that had very little bearing on the present. The primarchs were supposed to have died out millennia ago, long before the founding of the Guild, long before the current political structures of Veltharion had taken shape. Kale, apparently, had not gotten that particular message. He had survived, he told her, through a combination of deliberate withdrawal and careful concealment, spending long periods in isolation, emerging occasionally when drawn out by circumstances that required his attention, retreating again when they were resolved. He had not been trying to accumulate power or influence. He had been, by his own description, trying to live as quietly as something like him could manage to live, in a world that had moved a very long way past him without consulting his preferences. He had been betrayed, in the end, by something he had not expected to encounter. Genuine affection. He had, after several Centuries of careful isolation allowed himself to form connections. A small community in the northern reaches of Veltharion, a settlement of mixed supernatural lineages who had lived on land that fell outside the guild's administrative jurisdiction, and who had welcomed him with the practical warmth of people who needed an extra pair of capable hands more than they needed to ask questions about where those hands had come from. He had spent 40 years there. He had been, by his own account, happy in the way that a person is happy when they have stopped expecting to be. The Council of Five had found out about him. Not from a stranger, not from an enemy, from someone in the settlement itself. Someone who had decided, apparently, that the reward the Council was offering for information about any surviving Primarch was more valuable than 40 years of friendship and community. Kyle did not say this with bitterness, which Mira found more disturbing than if he had. He said it with the flat, settled quality of someone who has had 400 years to finish grieving a thing, and has arrived, on the other side of that grief, at something that is not forgiveness exactly, but is the place past forgiveness. The place where a thing simply is what it is. The Council had sent an extraction team. They had used the settlement itself as leverage, threatening the community that had sheltered Kale in order to ensure his cooperation. He had cooperated. He had gone with them because the alternative was the destruction of 40 years of people he loved, and the math of that had been very simple, even if the doing of it had not been. They had sealed him in the obsidian metal home, with the help of 3 of the most powerful binders in Veltharion's history, and a ritual that Kale described in technical detail, that Mira wrote down carefully, and then folded the page twice before placing it back in her notebook, because some information was best kept very close. They had told the settlement, she assumed, whatever story served the Council's purposes, and then the Council had taken the metal hone to the Guild, and the Guild had put it in the Forbidden Archive, and everyone had agreed, it seemed, never to speak of it again. "What did they want from you?" Mira asked when he had finished. "The Council, when they took you. What were they actually after?" The gold eyes considered her for a moment. The light he generated had, over the course of the night, strengthened and steadied into something more like lamplight, warm enough to read by. And she had the sense that this was an unconscious reflection of something in his internal state, that the light was some kind of emotional barometer she would need to learn to read. "Knowledge," he said. "I am the last Primarch. I carry within me the memory of the original transformation, the first making of what Veltharion's shifter lines have become. There are things I know about the nature of that power that the Council has been, seeking for as long as the Council has existed." He paused. "They wanted to extract it, not borrow it, not learn from me through conversation or study. Extract it, remove it from me and contain it for their own use. And you refused." "And I refused," he confirmed. "So they contained me instead, and waited, presumably, for an occasion on which refusal would not be an option." Mira looked at her notebook. The sun, she estimated, was coming up outside, which meant she had been in the archives, sub-basement for approximately 8 hours, which meant the morning staff would be arriving, which meant she needed to make a decision very quickly about what happened next. "The Council of Five," she said. "Is it the same council? After 400 years, the personnel obviously change, but the institution itself, the 5-seat structure, the same?" "I don't know," he said. "I have been in an obsidian stone." "Right. Sorry." She stood up, brushing dust from her skirt with automatic habit. "I need to go look at the acquisition records before anyone else comes in. If the record of your sealing exists, it will tell me which members of the Council authorized it, which will tell me whether the current Council has inherited that authorization, which will tell me how much danger we're both in right now." He rose when she rose, which she noticed, the automatic courtesy of something that had been, at some point, accustomed to interacting with humans in ways that had manners built into them. "You said we," he observed. "I said your name," she said. "Whatever is documented as the consequence of saying your name, I've now done it. The record of your sealing almost certainly notes that the seal breaks upon the speaking of the name, which means when they check the archive, and they will check the archive because these things are monitored, they will know it's been broken, which means they will come here, And they will find the empty medallion, and they will want to know who broke the seal. And the answer to that question is me. She looked at him levelly. So yes, we. Something moved through his expression that was complicated enough that she filed it away to think about later, when she had time for thinking. You are remarkably calm about this. I'm panicking internally, she said. I've found that keeping the panic on the inside is generally more useful. Can you conceal yourself? Make yourself small, metaphysically speaking. If you can avoid detection for the next few, hours while I look at the records, we'll have a better picture of what we're dealing with. He looked at her for a long moment. You are going to try to help me, he said. And it was not quite a question, but it had a question's intonation. The intonation of something that has learned to be careful with what it allows itself to expect. I am going to try to understand the situation, Mira said, which was true, and which was also the most comfortable way she had of saying the thing that was also true, which was that she had spent 7 years reading the memories of objects, and she had never once read one that held a grief as large as what she had felt when her fingers had closed around his metal home, and she did not know yet what that meant, but she knew it meant something. Understanding the situation seems like a necessary precondition for helping anyone, including myself. That is a very careful way, he said quietly, of saying something you are not yet ready to say. She picked up her lamp and her notebook. I'll be back before midday, she said. Don't let anyone see you. And if I'm not back by midday, it means something has gone wrong and you should... She paused, considering. You should probably leave. Go somewhere they won't look. I'll find a way to reach you. How? I don't know yet, she admitted. But I'm very good at finding things. It's essentially what I do. She left the archive's sub-basement and went to find the records, and behind her, in the room she had left, Kaelvorn stood in the fading light of his own making, and did something he had not allowed himself to do in 4 centuries. He waited for someone to come back. The acquisition records for the Forbidden Archive were kept in a separate section of the main archive, a room that Mira had full access to in her capacity as the assigned cataloger, which meant she could enter it at 7:30 in the morning with her notebook and her professional purpose, and nothing about her presence would register as unusual to anyone who happened to see her. This was one of the advantages she was discovering of being the kind of person that no one watched particularly carefully. She found the records for the century spanning the approximate period of Kael's sealing, and began to work backward through the acquisition logs, looking for the entry that would document the arrival of the obsidian metal home. It took her 40 minutes to find it, which was actually quite fast for this kind of archival work, and what she found when she found it made her sit very still in her chair for a moment, before she allowed herself to read it again, to make certain she had understood correctly. The acquisition had been authorized by all 5 members of the Council of 5, which she had expected. It had been executed by the head of the Guild's enforcement division, which she had also expected. What she had not expected was the additional notation at the bottom of the entry, in handwriting, different from the rest of the record, added apparently at a later date by someone other than the original scribe. The notation read, "Seal integrity to be verified by the Archivist General at each succession. Access to Level 3 restricted pending Council instruction. Name suppressed by order of continuity." Order of continuity. Mira knew what an order of continuity was. It was a guild mechanism that allowed a policy, a restriction, or a directive to remain in effect across administrative successions indefinitely, surviving changes in leadership until it was explicitly revoked by the same authority that had originally issued it. It was rarely used because it was essentially a way of tying the hands of future administrations, and future administrations tended to resent that. It was used when the original issuing authority wanted to make absolutely certain that what they had done remained done, regardless of what anyone who came after them might decide. The order of continuity on i.e. Kaelvorn's sealing had been in effect for 400 years, which meant that the current Council of 5, whoever they were, whatever their individual opinions on the matter, were bound by its terms, which meant that the moment they discovered the seal had been broken, they were obligated, by 400-year-old institutional authority, to re-establish it. Mira closed the acquisition record very carefully and sat with this information for a moment. Then she opened her notebook to a fresh page and began, methodically and with great focus, to think. If you're feeling that knot of tension I'm feeling right now, drop a comment below, because Mira is in a very particular kind of trouble, and I want to know who already sees where this is going. Don't go anywhere. The thing about Mira's gift, the thing that made it unusual even among other reading gifts, was that it did not just read the surface of an object's memory. Most readers in Veltharion with similar abilities could access the most recent or most emotionally intense memories stored in an object, the way a psychometrist reads impressions, surface-level emotional data that told you approximately what had happened and approximately how the people involved had felt about it. Mira read deeper than that. She read the accumulated layers of an object's entire history, the way a geologist reads rock strata, and what this gave her was not just impressions, but something closer to narrative, the full arc of what an object had been part of and why. She had never told anyone in the guild how deep her reading actually went. It had seemed, for the first several years of her employment, like information that would simply make her more interesting to the wrong people. And Mira had learned early that being interesting to the wrong people was generally not an advantageous condition. She had performed her gift at its most modest presentation, producing results that were useful enough to justify her employment, but not so exceptional as to attract the kind of scrutiny she did not want. This was, she was realizing, as she sat with her notebook in the records room at 7:30 in the morning, a strategy that had just become significantly more complicated, because she had not just read the name from the surface of the obsidian metal home. She had read the entire object, 400 years of sealed memory, the full history of what Kyle Vorn was, compressed into the stone by his own deliberate intention, waiting for a reader deep enough to receive it. She knew things about him that he had not told her in the sub-basement, and that he might not even know she knew. She knew the names of the people in the northern settlement who had been his community for 40 years. She knew the name of the person who had informed on him to the council, which was a piece of information she had already decided to keep to herself until she understood better what it was worth. She knew the specific nature of the knowledge the original council had wanted to extract from him, which was not merely historical lore about the original transformation, but something more precise and more dangerous. Something that the current council would want just as badly if they understood what they were still, technically, in possession of. She knew that the original sealing had been done with the understanding, among the 5 council members who authorized it, that it was not intended to be permanent. The original intention had been to break him, over time, in the dark, to erode whatever resistance he was maintaining through isolation and silence, and the slow, terrible weight of nothing, and then to bring him out and take what they needed from him. The order of continuity was not, as it had appeared in the record, simply a preservation order. It was a waiting strategy. It was an intention. And that, Mira thought, sitting very still with her notebook open in her lap, was the most important thing she had read in 7 years of reading things. She made a list. She was a cataloger. She made lists when the shape of a problem needed to become visible before it could be solved. Item 1. Kyle Vorn was free. The seal was broken and could not, as far as she could determine from the records, be re-established against his active resistance. The original sealing had required his cooperation, compelled through the threat against the settlement. With the settlement 400 years gone, and no current leverage, a re-sealing would require either new leverage or an overpowering force that she did not believe the current guild had available, not against a Primarch who was now free and aware. Item 2. The order of continuity meant that the current council was obligated to attempt resealing, regardless of whether they personally endorsed the original reasoning. Institutional memory was its own kind of obligation. Item 3. The current council did not know, could not know from the existing records, that the seal had been designed as a waiting strategy rather than a containment measure. The full reasoning behind the original sealing had not been recorded in the accessible documentation, which meant the current council was operating under an obligation without full understanding of its original purpose. Item 4. She was the only person who now had access to both the free Primarch and the complete archival record. She looked at her list for a moment. Then she added item 5, the cataloger who broke the eye. Seal was extremely findable, having signed in at the archive's main desk the previous evening with her full name and guild identification number, and the window between the seal's breaking and the monitoring system's next check was approximately 4 hours from now, which was not much time. She gathered her things, replaced the records she had removed, and walked back through the archive's main floor and down the stairs to the sub-basement, moving with the casual purposefulness of a person who was exactly where she was supposed to be doing exactly what she was supposed to be doing, which was the most effective form of invisibility she had ever discovered. Kyle was where she had left him, in the third room of the sub-basement. But the character of his stillness had changed. He was standing rather than sitting, and the gold light he generated had gone very low, barely a shimmer. The emotional barometer she was learning to read showing something that she parsed as the particular tension of someone who has been listening very carefully for a long time and heard something they did not like. Someone came into the archive, he said before she could speak. Upper floor. I could feel the presence through the walls. They were looking for something. The monitoring system runs on a schedule, Mira said, setting down her things. If someone came in this early, it wasn't the scheduled check. It was triggered. Triggered by what? By the seal breaking. Some seals have an immediate alert function, not just a scheduled monitoring. I didn't know about that specific feature of yours. I should have checked. She pulled out her notebook and opened it to her list, which means we have less time than I calculated, and the plan I was constructing needs to move faster. You have a plan, he said. It was not a skeptical statement. It was more like something said carefully by a person who has learned not to hope for things and is discovering that they are hoping anyway. I have the beginning of one, she corrected. The problem we're facing is this. The council is obligated to attempt to reseal you. They will almost certainly try to use me as leverage, the same way the original council used the settlement, because I'm easily findable, and I'm the one who broke the seal. The obvious counter to that is to make me less useful as leverage, which means making me less findable. She paused. The secondary problem is that the reason they originally wanted to seal you, the knowledge they were trying to extract, is still what they want. They won't stop just because the sealing failed. They'll find another way to try to get to it. He was watching her with an expression she was beginning to be able to read, which was the expression of someone who is tracking two separate things at once and trying to decide which one to address. You know more than I told you last night, he said. I read the metal home, she said carefully. A pause. You read the surface, the name. I read the whole thing, she said. I'm sorry. I couldn't stop it once it started. It doesn't work that way. And I should tell you that because you deserve to know the shape of what I know. And also, because if we're going to actually address this problem together, you're going to need to know what I have access to. And I'm not interested in pretending my gift is something other than what it is. She met his gold eyes steadily. I know about the settlement. I know the name of the person who informed on you to the council. I know what the original council actually wanted from you, and what the order of continuity was actually designed to accomplish. And I know that none of this has been recorded in any accessible document, which means the current council is operating with less information than I have. He was very still for a moment that felt long. The gold light had gone so low that she was navigating more by memory of the room's layout than by sight. And then, slowly, it came back. Up, not warm and amber the way it had been before, but clearer, brighter. The color of something that has been hot for a long time and has not cooled down yet. And you are telling me this, he said quietly, rather than using it. Using it how? The name of the informant, if I remember it at all, was the one thing I sealed into that stone that I was not certain I wanted anyone to ever find. It is a thing that could be used against me, against what remains of my capacity for something other than anger. I'm not going to use it against you, Mira said, and I'm not going to tell you who it was unless you ask me to tell you, because that decision should belong to you. But I needed you to know that I have it, because the other thing I read in your metal home, The thing that was in every layer of the stone all the way down to the oldest memory it held was that someone once had your complete trust and used it to destroy everything you'd built. She paused, choosing her words with the care she brought to labeling the archive's most fragile specimens. I don't want to be inside a plan with you while you're wondering whether I'm doing the same thing. So there it is, the full accounting of what I know. Do with that what you will. The silence afterward was one of those silences that has more going on inside it than the absence of sound normally allows. Mira waited in it and did not try to fill it, because she had learned from years of interviewing objects that the most important information often came in the pause after the straightforward question, not in the answer to it. You are not what I expected, Cale Vorn said at last, very quietly. When I was sealed, when I had accepted what was happening, I thought about what the world would be like after. I thought about the kind of person who would eventually find me. I thought usually about power, about someone looking for exactly what the council wanted to use me for. He paused. I did not think about someone with a notebook and a very practical relationship with danger. I'm a cataloger, Mira said. We're professionally required to take a practical relationship with things that have been in the dark for a long time. Something that was actually, this time, a smile moved across his face. It was not a large smile. It was the smile of something that has almost forgotten it knows how to make that particular shape, producing it carefully and slightly surprised by the result. But it was there. And Mira, who had read 400 years of grief and isolation from his metal home, and knew the full weight of what it had cost him to still be the thing she was looking at, thought that it was one of the more remarkable things she had seen in her professional career. Tell me your plan, he said. She told him, and he listened, and he asked questions, and they argued about two specific elements until they arrived at better versions of those elements. And by the time the upper floors of the archive were fully staffed with the morning shift and the monitoring system would have reported the broken seal to whoever was watching it, Mira Voss and Cale Vorn had the outline of something that was at least a plan and possibly, if it worked, the beginning of the end of a 400-year-old institutional deception. It was not, Mira thought, the worst first morning she had ever had at work. And we are absolutely not stopping here. Subscribe if you haven't already, because I need everyone in this community to see where this story goes. Let's keep moving. Senior archivist Davan arrived at his office at the Guildhall at precisely 8:45 in the morning and found 3 things waiting for him. The first was his morning correspondence, neatly stacked. The second was a cup of tea, which his assistant had placed there while the temperature was still correct. The third was a representative of the Council of Five, sitting in the chair across from his desk with the particular quality of stillness that powerful people developed when they wanted to communicate that they had been waiting, and that the waiting had been noted. Councillor Voss's representative, a man named Farron, who held the title of Special Enforcement Liaison, had the face and manner of someone who had been selected for their current role specifically because they did not waste time on social warmth. He looked at Davan over steepled fingers and said without preamble, "The Vorn seal has been broken." Davan sat down. He was a Guiane, careful man, which was how he had survived in his position for 17 years. And being careful meant that he did not, in this moment, allow his face to do anything more expressive than a mild, attentive concern. "I see," he said. "When?" "Last night, between the 2200 and 0600 monitoring checks. Your cataloger was in the sub-basement during that window." A pause. "Mira Voss, working on the inventory assignment you authorized." Davan looked at his tea. He thought about Mira Voss, whom he had known for 7 years, and trusted precisely because she was not the kind of person who attracted trouble. He thought about the assignment he had given her, which had seemed at the time like a reasonable administrative task, and which was now, it appeared, something significantly more complicated. Has she been located? She came in at her normal time this morning. She is currently in the main archive. She has not been approached yet. The council wanted your assessment of her first. My assessment. She works for you. You know her capabilities, her background, her gift. Farron's expression suggested that he found this conversation slightly tedious, but was willing to have it if it produced useful information. Is she a threat? Devon thought about this carefully. The correct answer, the answer that 17 years of careful survival had trained him to give, was no. Mira Voss was a junior cataloger with a minor reading gift. She was not a threat. She had probably activated the seal by accident. She should be questioned, reassured, and returned to her duties while the council handled the Vorn matter from here. That was the answer he had been trained to give. He found, to his mild surprise, that he was not entirely certain he was going to give it. She is intelligent, he said instead, which was true and technically responsive to the question, and contained, if one read it carefully, a warning that could plausibly be denied. She has been working in the archive for 7 years, and has not, to my knowledge, done anything that would indicate divided loyalties. She is methodical. She is precise. She does not make accidental mistakes in her work. Farron studied him for a moment. You are suggesting the activation was not accidental. I am suggesting, Devon said carefully, that Mira Voss is not the kind of person who picks up an object she has not yet researched without her gloves on. This was, he was aware, a significant thing to say. He was aware that in saying it he was doing something that 17 years of careful survival had generally counseled against, which was making himself visible in a situation where visibility was dangerous. He was doing it anyway, because he had known Mira Voss for 7 years, and she had done something that he thought, in the deep, careful part of himself that had survived everything by being honest with itself, was the right thing to do, and he was not willing to be the one who handed her to the council without at least making the shape of his misgivings visible to someone. Farron rose. The council will want to speak with her, he said. I'm certain they will, Devon agreed, and watched Farron leave, and then sat for a moment with his tea and his knowledge and the awareness that he had just made a choice that was going to have consequences, and the further awareness that he did not, on reflection, regret it. Mira was in the main archive, as Farron had reported, working at her regular station with her regular materials, doing the regular work of the regular senior cataloger that she had been for 7 years. And the thing about her doing this was that it was not, in fact, a cover. She genuinely was working. She had reports to file, documentation to complete, 3 items from the general collection that required processing before the end of the week. The work was real, and she was doing it, because Mira Voss had discovered very early in her archive career that the best way to look like you were doing exactly what you were supposed to be doing was to actually be doing exactly what you were supposed to be doing, while also simultaneously doing the other thing. The other thing, in this case, was thinking. She had come back upstairs after leaving Kale in the sub-basement, and she had spent the time between her return and the arrival of the morning staff, using one of the archive's research terminals to look up 3 specific pieces of information. The first was the current membership of the Council of 5, which she had known in outline, but wanted confirmed in detail. The second was the legal mechanism by which an order of continuity could be revoked, which she had suspected she knew but needed to verify. The third was the current status of the land in the northern reaches of Veltharion, where the settlement had been 400 years ago, which was an inquiry that probably looked quite strange in the research terminal's access log, but which Mira had decided was worth the strangeness. What she had found was this. The Council of 5 currently consisted of 3 members who had been in their seats for more than 20 years, and 2 who had been appointed in the last decade. The long-serving members were the ones who mattered for her purposes, specifically the eldest of them, a woman named Councillor Ashvane, who had held her seat for 31 years, and who was, according to the Guild's historical records, the direct institutional successor of the line of councillors that had originally authorized Kale's sealing. If the order of continuity lived anywhere in the current council's institutional memory, it lived with Ashvane. The mechanism for revoking an order of continuity required either a unanimous vote of the current issuing authority, which in this case meant the full Council of 5, or the presentation of evidence that the original order had been issued based on materially false information, which would trigger an automatic review process through the Guild's judicial division. The second option was interesting to Mira for reasons that she was still in the process of thinking through carefully. The land in the north, the settlement land, was currently unoccupied common territory, which was what happened to land that had been abandoned long enough to revert to its original designation. It had been unoccupied for approximately 380 years. She was sitting with the shape of this information and deciding what to do with it when she became aware that someone was standing near her station and looked up to find Farron looking down at her. "Cataloger Voss," he said, "the council requests your presence." She saved her work, capped her pen, and stood up with the measured calm of someone who has been expecting exactly this and is ready for it. "Of course," she said. "I'll just need to note where I've left off for the morning." He waited while she did this, and she let him wait because she was who she was, and she did things in order. And the 2 minutes it took her to complete her documentation note were 2 minutes in which she was demonstrating, to herself as much as to him, that she was not afraid. Or rather, that she was afraid, and she was doing the things she needed to do anyway, which was the more important skill. The council chamber was on the top floor of the guild hall, and walking through it was like walking through the official version of Veltharian's history, which was to say that it was very grand and very curated and contained, Mira thought, somewhat less than the full truth. The walls bore portraits of past counselors, and the furniture was ancient and beautifully maintained, and everything in the room had been selected to communicate permanence and authority, the visual language of power that has been in place long enough to have stopped noticing itself. Counselor Ashvane was at the head of the table. She was a small woman of considerable age, without the particular quality of the long-lived supernatural, which was that age showed in the eyes rather than the face, a depth of experience and calculated patience that the face could no longer entirely contain. She looked at Mira with those eyes, and Mira looked back with hers, and for a moment the room was very quiet. "You broke the Vorn seal," Ashvane said. Not an accusation, precisely. A statement of fact being laid on the table for examination. "I read an object that was in the collection I was assigned to catalog," Mira said. "The seal broke as a consequence. You know what you released." "I know what I found," Mira said, which was careful and accurate and slightly different from what Ashvane had said, and she saw in Ashvane's eyes that the counselor had noticed the difference. "The order of continuity requires us to re-establish the seal," Ashvane said. "This is not a choice. It is an institutional obligation." "I understand that," Mira said. "I also understand that an order of continuity can be revoked if it can be demonstrated that the original order was issued based on materially false information." A silence settled over the council chamber that had a different quality from the silence before it. Mira kept her eyes on Ashvane's and did not look at the other counselors, because she had decided in the archive that Ashvane was the one who mattered here. Ashvane was the one who carried the institutional memory. And if there was a path through this, it ran through her. "That is a very specific piece of legal knowledge," Ashvane said, "for a cataloger." "I spend a great deal of time in archives," Mira said. "What I found in the acquisition record for the Vorn Metal Hoe is that the notation describing the purpose of the order of continuity characterized it as a containment measure, a protective action, but the full record, which I have now read, indicates that the original purpose was extraction. The order was issued not to protect Veltharian from a dangerous entity, but to preserve access to a resource the original council intended to exploit." She paused. "That is a material misrepresentation of the purpose for which an order of continuity was issued, and it constitutes grounds for mandatory review." The silence was very complete now. Farron, standing against the wall, had a quality about him that Mira categorized as someone who has just understood that the meeting they thought they were running is not the meeting they are actually in. "You are making a very serious claim," Ashvane said. "I am a cataloger," Mira said. "I document what is in the record. What is in the record is what I have described to you." Another silence. Then Ashvane said very quietly, "Where is he now?" And this, Mira thought, was the question that everything turned on. Where is he now? Because the answer to that question, if given directly and honestly, would tell the council exactly what they needed to know to deploy whatever resources they had available And the plan she had made in the sub-basement depended on those resources being deployed somewhere other than where Kale actually was. But it also depended on Ashvane, specifically, on the thing she had read in the oldest layer of the acquisition record that had told her something about the counselor that Ashvane herself might not know she had revealed, because the original 5 counselors who had authorized Kale's sealing were all dead, obviously, 400 years gone, but the record of the vote had included, as old guild records did, a note of any dissent, and the counselor in the seat that Ashvane now occupied, the seat whose institutional memory she had inherited along with its authority, had cast the only dissenting vote on the original order of continuity, had been overruled 4-1, and had then, as the record showed, complied with the majority's decision as institutional duty required. But the dissent was there, pressed into the record the same way Kale's name had been pressed into the stone, waiting for someone to read deep enough to find it. "He is somewhere safe," Mira said carefully. "He is not planning to harm anyone. He has been in the dark for 400 years, and what he wants is to not be in the dark anymore. That's all. And I would like the opportunity to demonstrate that, before the council makes any decisions about what the order of continuity requires." Ashvane looked at her for a long moment, looked at her with those eyes that had more depth in them than the face that held them, and Mira had the sense that the counselor was reading something too. Not objects, but people. The way that power that has existed long enough develops the ability to read people the way Mira read objects. The accumulated layers of a person's history, compressed into the present moment. "You have 24 hours, Ashvane said finally, and the other counselors looked at her with varying degrees of surprise that they were mostly successful at. "Containing. Bring him here. Under proper terms, proper protections, a formal deposition. If his account supports your claim about the original order's purpose, the review process will be initiated. A pause. If it does not, or if he does not appear, the order stands, and the council will take whatever action is necessary." 24 hours, Mira agreed. "Thank you, counselor." She walked out of the council chamber with the steady, unhurried pace of a cataloger who has completed a task and is moving on to the next one. And in the corridor outside, she stopped and stood still for a moment with her eyes closed and her hands pressed flat against the cold stone wall, and allowed herself exactly 15 seconds of the panic that had been internal since 7:30 that morning. Then she opened her eyes and went back to work. "This is the part where everything pivots, and I need you to tell me in the comments whether you saw Ashvane coming, because I want to know who was reading. Between the lines. Let's keep going. We are nowhere near done." The 24 hours were not straightforward, and Mira had not expected them to be. Getting Kale from the sub-basement of the guild hall to anywhere that was not the sub-basement of the guild hall required solving several logistical problems simultaneously, the most significant of which was that a Primarch walking through the main corridors of a heavily warded building was going to register on approximately every supernatural detection system the guild employed. And while Ashvane had given them 24 hours, Mira was not certain that everyone else in the chain of command had received that message with the same emphasis. She went back to the sub-basement at midday, as promised, and found Kale in the same position she had left him, which was standing in the corner nearest the door, with the stillness of something that has been listening to every footstep in the building overhead and cataloging them. The gold. Light was low and very steady, the barometer reading something she was coming to interpret as focused waiting, the specific quality of patience that was not peace, but was discipline. "The council gave us 24 hours, she said, closing the door behind her. "Ashvane. She wants a formal deposition, your account against the official record. If it holds up, she can initiate a review that could revoke the order of continuity." 24 hours, he repeated. And then they will. Either accept the review process or they won't. If they won't, things become significantly more complicated. She pulled out her notebook. "Before we deal with the logistics of getting you to a deposition, I need to tell you something." He had been watching her with the focused quality that she was also learning. The way he attended to her specifically, different from how he attended to the sounds of the building or the movement of air through the archive's ventilation. A kind of attention that was chosen rather than automatic. Tell me, the counselor in the seat that Ashvane now holds, her institutional predecessor, voted against the original order of continuity, Mira said, was overruled 4-1 and then complied with the majority's decision. But she voted against it. The gold light did something complex, a flicker and then a settling, the barometer reading something she could not entirely parse, but which felt like the meeting of an old wound with a new piece of information. I did not know that, he said quietly. I didn't think you did. The descent notation is in a part of the record that only reads clearly at the depth level I was working at. It's been sitting there for 400 years, without anyone knowing it was there. She paused. I thought you should know that it was not unanimous. That someone, even then, said no. He was quiet for a long time. The gold light strengthened slowly, not to the clear hot brightness it had reached earlier in the morning, but to something warmer, more complex, the color of something that is processing. Why does that matter to you? He asked finally. Telling me that. Because you spent 400 years in the dark believing that the world had closed completely against you, Mira said. And it's not true. It wasn't true even then. And I think she chose her words carefully, as she always did. But this time the care was not professional, but personal, which was a different kind of care entirely. I think being in the dark for that long, alone, teaches you things about the world that feel certain, but aren't always correct. And I would rather you know the full shape of what happened than just the shape that the dark had time to carve into you. The silence after this was the longest of the ones they had had. Cale stood in the corner of the archive's sub-basement, and the gold light moved through colors she had not seen it reach before. And Mira sat on her crate with her notebook, and did not try to fill the silence, because some things needed the full space of their silence to become real. I sealed that stone, he said at last very quietly, intending for it to outlast me, intending for whoever eventually found it to be someone who would understand what they had, and use it carefully, and do with the information whatever served their own purposes. I did not intend for the reading to be what it was. I did not intend to give someone my complete history and then watch them use it to try to help me. He paused. I am finding that I do not know how to account for you. You don't have to account for me, Mira said. I'm not an object. I don't need to be catalogued. Something moved across his face that was more complicated than the smile from earlier. The smile that had surprised him. This was something that had been through more than a smile. Something that had been through the long, dark way that the smile had not yet reached. No, he said. You are not an object. A pause. And his voice when he continued was lower, quieter, holding the specific, careful quality of something said by a person who has almost stopped knowing how to say personal things. You are the first person who has known the complete truth of me, and chosen to act on the truth, rather than on what the truth could be used to accomplish. In 400 years of existence, I can count on one hand the number of times that has been true. And the last time it was true, I was in a settlement in the north. And I had 40 years. Mira looked at him. She thought about what she had read in the metal hoe, the accumulated layers of it, the long loneliness and the grief and the patience, and, underneath all of it, the things that had not been erased even by 4 centuries of darkness. The memory of warmth, the memory of community, the specific quality of happiness that comes from a life that fits the shape of the person living it. She thought about those things still being present in him, all that time. Later, not worn away but simply waiting, the way certain memories and objects waited at the bottom of everything, outlasting everything placed over them. Tell me about the settlement, she said. Not the end of it, the middle of it. What 40 years of being happy looked like. He looked at her for a moment, and then he sat down on the crate, and he told her. And the gold light went steady and warm, and outside the archive the city of Veltarion went about its afternoon, and in the sub-basement, 2 people who had each spent a long time being invisible to the world they moved through found, in the particular privacy of a place that was full of forgotten things, something that felt, tentatively and carefully, like the beginning of being found. There is something about a love story built in the dark that I find more moving than almost any other kind, And if you feel the same way, I hope you'll leave me a comment telling me what it is about this one that's getting to you, because we still have so much further to go. The logistics of moving Kyle through the Guildhall proved, as Mira had anticipated, complicated, and the solution they arrived at was one she would not have considered without the specific knowledge she had accumulated over 7 years in the archive. The sub-basement of the Guildhall was connected by a passage that was documented in exactly one record that she had found in her 2nd year, and remembered because it had seemed interesting at the time, to the old infrastructure of the city beneath, the pre-guild network of service tunnels that had been built in Veltharian's founding era, and subsequently forgotten when the city built over and around them. The passage was sealed, but it was sealed with a guild ward, rather than a supernatural seal, and a guild ward was exactly the kind of thing that a senior cataloger with full archive access could deal with given the right documentation. It took her 3 hours to acquire that documentation through official channels, which was faster than it should have been because Devon, who had apparently made some calculation of his own during the morning's events, had signed her clearance request with a speed that suggested he had been waiting for it to arrive. She did not stop to examine this too closely. She noted it, added it to her understanding of the situation, and moved on. The tunnel passage connected to a section of the old city that was now used primarily for municipal storage, which was empty at the time of their passage, and from there to a district of the city called the Vaults, which was the informal name for the neighborhood that had grown up around Veltharian's oldest residential structures, buildings that predated the guild by several centuries, and which had, by virtue of their age, accumulated wards and countermeasures against detection that were now simply part of their architectural fabric. Mira had a contact in the Vaults, a woman named Petra, who ran a kind of unofficial hostelry for people whose need for discretion outweighed their need for formal accommodation, and who owed Mira a favor from an archival project 3 years ago that Mira had never called in until now. Kale moved through the tunnels and the old city with a quality of presence that was different from anything Mira had encountered before. He moved through space the way old things moved through time, with a displacement that was felt before it was seen, a gravitational quality that was not threatening exactly, but was impossible to mistake for ordinary. She watched him navigate the darkness of the tunnels. The light he generated tuned very low by an act of deliberate will she could see him maintaining. And she thought about the settlement in the north, and the 40 years, and what it must have meant to finally stop moving, to put down the weight of all those centuries, and simply be somewhere. She thought about the name in the stone. She thought about the way his history had come, through the obsidian, into her hands, and up through her arms, and settled into her in the way that the most significant memories always settled, the ones that were going to be with her for the rest of her life, regardless of whether she chose them. She thought about the fact that she had read the entire history of a being who had existed longer than the political structures that governed her world, and that what she had found, underneath all of it, was someone who was recognizable, who was, in the ways that mattered, knowable. She thought about the way he had said her name in the dark of the archive's first night, before she had told it to him. She was going to think about that for a long time, she suspected. Possibly the rest of her life. Petra received them with the professional discretion of someone who has been in the business of not asking questions for a long time, set them up in a room on the 2nd floor that had 3 separate ward seals on it, and brought them, without being asked, tea and food, because Petra was a person who had decided that whatever the situation, tea and food were generally applicable to it, and she had not, in 30 years of practice, been proven wrong. Mira ate and documented and thought. Kale ate slowly, with the careful deliberateness of something relearning the mechanics of physical need after a very long time without them, and watched her work across the small table. The room was quiet, and the wards were holding, and for the first time, since her fingers had closed around the obsidian stone the previous evening, Mira felt something ease slightly in the back of her mind, the tight-coiled readiness of someone who has been managing an emergency by sheer focus. "The deposition," Kale said, at some point in the evening. "What you need from me. I need your account of the original sealing. The circumstances, the council's stated intentions, Anything said or done that demonstrates the purpose was extraction rather than containment. The more specific, the better. Names, dates, direct statements if you remember them. She looked up from her notebook. 400 years is a long time. Memory erodes. Not mine, he said quietly. One of the things about being a Primarch is that the memory does not erode. Everything I have experienced is in me the same way the knowledge in the stone is in me. Layered, present, accessible. I remember every word the council said to me when they came for me. I remember every hour of the negotiation. I remember exactly what they told me they wanted and exactly what they promised if I gave it to them. A pause. I remember the name of every person in the settlement and what they looked like and what they were doing on the last day I saw them. Mira looked at him steadily. That is both a gift and a very heavy thing to carry. Yes, he said simply. It is both. She held his gaze for a moment, and then she did something that was not cataloging and not strategic and not any of the other things she had been doing for the past 20 hours. She reached across the table and put her hand on his, briefly, the way a person does when the only true language for a thing is not words, but presence, and then she took her hand back and returned to her notebook, because there was still work to do, and she was who she was. He did not say anything, but the gold light in the room strengthened, steady and warm, and she felt him look at her for a long time after, with the gold eyes, that had been in the dark for 400 years and were now, in this small warded room in the oldest part of a city that had almost forgotten it had foundations, in the light. The deposition was set for 10 the following morning, which meant Mira had not slept in approximately 30 hours by the time she sat down in the guild's formal deposition chamber, with her notebook and her carefully organized documentation, and Cale Vorn beside her, presenting to the Council of Five an account that was so specific and so precisely detailed, and so absolutely at odds with the official record that Councillor Ashvane, listening from her place at the head of the table, closed her eyes at one point and did not open them again for what seemed like a very long time. It took 4 hours. Cale spoke with the focused precision of a memory that did not erode, walking through the events of 400 years ago with a clarity that made the chamber very quiet, the kind of quiet that settles when people are hearing things they already, in the back of some institutional consciousness, knew, but had not been required to confront directly. The other counselors asked questions. Mira produced supporting documentation. Farron, present again, but now in a different capacity. The capacity of someone who is watching the ground shift under an institution they work for, asked no questions at all. When it was done, Ashvane called for a recess, and the counselors withdrew to deliberate, and Mira and Kyle were left in the deposition chamber with 2 guild functionaries, who were there to ensure nothing untoward happened, and who were visibly uncertain about what, exactly, their responsibilities were in this particular circumstance. You're thinking, Cale said quietly beside her. I'm always thinking, she said. That's not useful information. You're thinking about something specific. She looked at him sideways. What does the knowledge feel like? She asked. The original transformation knowledge. The thing they wanted. What does it actually feel like to carry it? He considered this. Like carrying a language that no one else speaks, he said after a moment. Like knowing the grammar of something that the world has been speaking in fragments and errors for so long that everyone has forgotten there is a complete version. A pause. It is not a weapon. That was always what they misunderstood. They wanted to extract it and use it as a tool of power, to enhance the abilities of their preferred lines, to strengthen the dominant hierarchies. But the knowledge is not that. The original transformation is about balance, about the full range of what the gift is, not just the parts that serve dominance. He looked at her. What the Council has been seeking to possess for 400 years is something that, if actually understood rather than exploited, would be deeply inconvenient for the structures of power that benefit from the way the gift is currently distributed. Mira looked at him for a long moment. The knowledge, if disseminated freely through proper scholarship rather than extracted and monopolized, would challenge the hierarchy. Fundamentally, he confirmed. And the Council knew this. The original Council. They knew it, he said, which is why they wanted to control the access to it. rather than allow it to circulate. A Primarch who chose to share the knowledge freely with any scholar who sought it would be far more dangerous to the existing structures of power than any military threat. Mira thought about this. She thought about 7 years in the archive, reading the memories of objects, reading the deep true layers of things that had been buried under the official account. She thought about what it meant to be a keeper of records in an institution that had, for 400 years, been keeping the wrong records. She thought about what cataloging actually was, at its most fundamental. The act of saying this exists, this is real, this is part of the record. This cannot be unmade by pretending it was never there. If you testified freely, she said carefully, if you gave depositions to the Guild's scholarship division rather than just to the council, if the knowledge were entered into the open record rather than confined to whatever the review process produces, could you do that? He looked at her for a long time. That would be a significant choice, he said, one with significant consequences. Yes, she agreed. The council would not simply accept it. The review might revoke the order of continuity, but that does not mean they would endorse the free circulation of information they have been trying to control for 4 centuries. No, she agreed. But there is a difference between an institution not endorsing something and an institution having the authority to stop it. If the order of continuity is revoked, their specific legal basis for controlling your movements and your speech is gone. The Guild cannot silence a free being. Not legally, not under its own charter. Kale was quiet for a moment. Then, you have been thinking about this since the archive. I've been thinking about this since I read the 3rd layer of your metal hull, she said honestly. I just needed to understand enough of the present situation before I knew whether it was viable. And now you believe it is viable. I believe, Mira said, that the most effective thing either of us can do in this situation is make the true record. Not just for the deposition, for the full record. Everything you carry, properly documented, properly attributed, submitted to the scholarly archive where it cannot be confiscated or suppressed without the Guild violating its own foundational principles. She paused. I am a cataloger. That is what I do. I make things part of the record so that they cannot be unmade. I think you have been waiting a very long time for someone to do that for you. The gold light in the deposition chamber had been steady, and lo, throughout the 4 hours of testimony, the careful, controlled stillness of something that was managing itself in a difficult circumstance. Now it shifted, not to the heat it had reached in moments of agitation, but to something different, something she had not seen before from it, the particular quality of warmth that is not temperature, but is nonetheless felt as warmth, the kind of light that things move toward rather than away from. You are, Kelvorn said quietly, the most remarkable person I have encountered in 400 years of existence. I've had access to very good records, Mira said. It helps. He looked at her. She looked at him. And in the space between them, in the quiet of the deposition chamber while the Council of 5 deliberated in another room about the fate of something they had been trying to control since before any of their institutional predecessors had been born, something that had been tentative and careful and provisional in the preceding 24 hours became something else, became a thing with weight and direction, became the kind of certain that 2 people make together when they have each spent a long time being uncertain and have found in each other a reason to stop. He reached across the space between them and tucked a strand of her hair back from her face, very gently, with the careful hands of someone who is aware of his own strength and has decided that gentleness is the better use of it. And Mira, who catalogued things, who documented things, who made things part of the permanent record, thought, this is what I am keeping. This is what does not get buried. When this is over, he said quietly. And the when rather than the if was a small gift, and he knew it, and she knew it. When this is over, she agreed. And if you are feeling what I am feeling right now, please let me know in the comments, because we are about to go through the part that changes everything, and I need you with me for it. The council's deliberation took 3 hours, which was long by Guild standards, and which Mira interpreted correctly. as an indication that the vote was not unanimous. When they returned to the chamber, Ashvane's face had the quality of someone who has won an argument they expected to have, but had hoped they would not need to. "The review board will examine the original order of continuity within 30 days, she announced. "Pending the outcome of that review, the order is suspended. Cale Vorn is granted provisional standing within the guild's jurisdiction, subject to certain conditions." She paused, and her eyes moved from Cale to Mira and back, with the assessing quality of someone who has been watching two people for several hours and has drawn conclusions that she is keeping professionally to herself. "Cataloger Voss will serve as the primary point of contact for the provisional standing arrangement." Farron, in the corner, had the expression of someone who has processed that the meeting they thought they were running ended 3 hours ago, and that everything since then has been a different meeting entirely. The 30 days that followed were the most complex and most extraordinary of Mira's life, which had not, before the night she read the obsidian metal home, been a life that was particularly accustomed to complexity. Cale Vorn moved, under his provisional standing, from Petra's discreet hostelry to a set of rooms in the older district of the Yai city, and Mira, who had a small apartment above a bakery with a cat named Sable, spent a significant amount of time in those rooms, sometimes on guild business, and sometimes not. The testimony for the scholarship division took 3 weeks and produced documentation that Mira organized and catalogued with the meticulous care she brought to every archival project, which was to say with extraordinary thoroughness and a comprehensive cross-referencing system that would make it navigable for generations of subsequent scholars. She was aware, as she organized it, that she was doing the most significant archival work of her career, possibly the most significant archival work that had been done in the Guild's modern history, which was a thing she felt the weight of and was glad to carry. The review board met in the 4th week. The arguments were lengthy, the documentation was comprehensive, and the outcome, when it came, was precisely what the documentation warranted. The order of continuity was revoked. The original sealing was formally characterized as an act of institutional overreach, executed under materially false pretenses. A formal apology was entered into the Guild's official record, which meant it would be in the archive forever, pressed into the fabric of the institution's documented history, the same way truth pressed into the deepest layers of the objects Mira read. Ashvane came to find Mira after the board's decision was announced. She found her in the archive, which was where Mira was most days when she was not in the testimony sessions, and she sat across from her at the research table with the particular manner of someone who has something to say that they are going to say in their own time and in their own way. "My predecessor voted no," Ashvane said, after a moment. "On the original order." "Yes," Mira said. "You knew that before you came to the council chamber. You knew it from the records." "Yes." A silence. "You were betting that institutional memory ran deeper than institutional obligation," Ashvane said. "That the fact of a dissent, 400 years old, would matter to the person who held the dissenting seat." "I was hoping it would," Mira said carefully. "I thought it was the kind of thing that, if it were true of you, would be findable in the record if you knew where to look. And it was." Ashvane studied her for a long moment. "You read people the way you read objects," she said. "I thought your gift was for objects." "It is," Mira said. "But records are objects. Institutions are built out of their records. The memory of what an institution has done and been is in the record the same way any other memory is in any other object. If you know how to read deeply enough." She paused. "You have been in your seat for 31 years. The record of everything your seat has been for 400 years is underneath you. It was there to read." Ashvane was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "You should not be a cataloger." "I like being a cataloger," Mira said. "You should be an archivist general," Ashvane said. "When Davin retires, which I am told he is considering." A pause. "His clearance request the other day, he signed it in under 10 minutes. I checked." Mira thought about Davin, who had told her she was intelligent in the way that contained a warning, and had signed her clearance in under 10 minutes, and had been, quietly, an ally. in the way that people who are mostly careful can be allies, when something important enough makes the calculation change. "That's a conversation for another time," she said. "It is," Ashvane agreed, and left, and Mira sat for a moment with the weight of the conversation and the weight of the past 30 days, and all the various weights she was carrying. And then she gathered her things, and she left the archive, and she walked to the older district of the city, where the rooms with the appropriate ward seals were, and she knocked on the door. Kyle opened. He was, she thought, learning to take up space again, learning to exist in a world that had room for him in it, and it showed in small ways. The slight straightening of his bearing, the gold light that lived in the air around him at a steady and unguarded level, rather than the careful dimness he had maintained in the first days. He looked at her, and the light warmed. "The order is revoked," she said. He was quiet for a moment. The gold light did something complex and beautiful, the full range of what it could do when he was not managing it. A slow pulse of warmth through the space between them. "And the scholarship record? Entered, cross-referenced, accessible to any researcher with standard academic clearance." She looked at him. "It cannot be suppressed. It is part of the record now. It exists." He looked at her for a long time. Then he stepped back from the door to let her in, which was a small thing, and also not a small thing, and she came in, and the door closed behind. Her and the gold light in the room was the color of the part of the evening when the day has not entirely let go yet, and the night has not entirely arrived, the particular warmth of things that are in the process of becoming. "You did this," he said quietly. "All of it. We did this," she said. "You testified. You remembered. You gave me everything that was in the stone, and a great deal more besides. You knew what to do with it." "I know what to do with records," she said. "That's my job. You were in the record, buried under 400 years of institutional silence, and my job is to find things in the record and bring them back into the light." He looked at her for a long moment. "And now that I am in the light?" She looked back at him steadily. This ancient, careful thing that had been in the dark for so long, and was standing in a room in the oldest part of the city of Veltharion, with the gold of him moving through the air like a visible warmth, and she thought, he already knows the answer to this question. He is asking it because he wants to hear me say it, which is the most human thing that has happened in this entire extraordinary month, and I am not going to give him an insufficient answer. "Now," she said, "you stay in the light, and I stay with you, and we figure out what that looks like, together, which is going to take considerably longer than 30 days, and probably longer than the rest of both our lifetimes, which in your case is a significant commitment. But I am a cataloger, and I am accustomed to long-term projects." The gold light filled the room completely. Kyle Vorn, the last Primarch, the ancient black lion, the entity that had not been seen in centuries, the thing that had been in the dark and was now, finally, in the light, looked at Mira Voss, who was a cataloger with a minor gift and a notebook, and a cat named Sable, and a practical relationship with danger. And he crossed the small room, and he kissed her, very carefully, with the care of something that has decided that gentleness is the better use of its strength, and she kissed him back with the certainty of someone who has read the complete record and knows exactly what she is choosing. Outside the window, the city of Veltharion went about its evening, and in the oldest district of the city, in a room full of the warm gold light of something ancient that had finally found its way home, two people who had each spent a very long time being invisible to the world began, together, the work of being seen. Epilogue. 3 years after the Review Board's decision, the Guild's Scholarship Division published what became known in Veltharion's academic community simply as the Vorn Compendium, 12 volumes of transcribed testimony, historical analysis, and original source documentation covering the complete history of Veltharion's supernatural lineages from their Primarch origins to the present day. It was the most significant scholarly publication in the Guild's 400-year history. Mira catalogued it personally. She was, by then, the Archivist General, having accepted Devon's recommendation when it came with the understanding that the role did not require her to stop cataloging things herself, but simply gave her the authority to ensure that the cataloging was done properly at every level of the institution. She brought to the position the same practical thoroughness she had brought to 7 years of sub-basement work. And the institution changed, slowly and systemically, in the ways that institutions change, when the person responsible for the record understands that what is documented determines what is real. Kyle Vorn became the Guild's first scholar of Primarch studies, a position that had not existed before, and that Ashvane had authorized with the particular expression of someone doing a thing that is right and slightly inconvenient. He taught. He testified. He gave access to his memory to researchers who asked for it with appropriate scholarly rigor, and he watched, with the careful attention of something that has seen a very long time, as the knowledge that had been locked in obsidian and sealed under institutional silence for 4 centuries became, instead, part of the common inheritance of a world that had been doing without it. The northern lands where the settlement had been were formally restored to common heritage status, and a small memorial was placed there by the Guild's Historical Preservation Committee at Mira's recommendation, documenting what had been there and what had been lost. Kale went to see it, once, in the 2nd year after the revocation, and Mira went with him, and they stood in the northern cold, with the winter light, and the memorial stone, and the long past that was still present in the way all pasts are present, when there is a memory that does not erode, and she took his hand, and he let her, and they stood there until he was ready to leave, and then they left together. Sable the cat, who had from the beginning regarded the situation of Kale Vorn with the equanimity of a creature who has decided that all human behavior is mildly baffling, but rarely worth intervening in, eventually accepted him into the household with the conditional approval of a small creature who is reserving the right to revoke that approval at any point. Kale, who had survived 400 years and the Council of 5 and the full weight of institutional suppression, was, Mira thought, more careful with the cat's approval than with any of the rest of it. She did not tell him this. It seemed like information he could have for free. In the evenings, in the apartment above the bakery that smelled like the most comforting thing in the world, the gold light that lived in the air around Kale Vorn moved through the rooms at a steady warmth that the neighbors eventually stopped finding unusual and began instead to find, simply, part of the character of the building. A warm building, they said. The light is different there. It is not like anywhere else. And in the archive, where the smell of leather and ink and the slow, patient decay of old wood still settled over everything like a benediction, the record had been changed. Not erased, not falsified, not managed into a shape that served the purposes of power. Changed the way the record changes when the truth is added to it, carefully and completely, so that anyone who looks at it, now, or 100 years from now, or 400 years from now, will see not the official version, but the full version, the version with all its layers present, the version that says, this existed, this was real, this was hidden, and now it is found. That was what catalogers did. That was what Mira did. She documented what was real so that it could not be unmade. And what was real, in the end, was this. A woman with a notebook and a lamp and a gift for reading deep, in the sub-basement of a building full of forgotten things, who read, a name in a stone and changed everything, and an ancient thing that had been in the dark, who heard his name spoken and chose, when the dark broke open, not to be what 4 centuries of isolation had every right to make him, but instead something older than that, and therefore something more patient, more careful, more capable of the particular tenderness that has been earned rather than assumed. 2 people who were each, in their different ways, accustomed to being invisible to the world, who found, in a room full of forgotten things, someone who could read all the way down to the truest layer, who were, in the end, found. Thank you so much for being here for this story. If it moved you even a fraction of how much it moved me to bring it to you, please leave a like, leave a comment, share it with someone who needs a love story that was worth the wait. Subscribe if you haven't already, because there are more stories like this one coming. Stories about being seen, about what survives. The Dark, about the archive of things the world tried to forget that refused to be forgotten. I'll see you in the next one.